All right, take us away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us and coming out on this warm but wonderful day. We are glad to have you, and we're hoping that this session will be informative and that we have a lively discussion at the end and get you excited about going out there and getting something published. So our session is called The Inside Scoop on Getting Published, and it's presented in partnership with CAPAL's Research and Scholarship Committee and editors from the Canadian Journal of Academic Librarianship. Next slide, please. So who are we? We've got some folks from both, but I'll mention who's on CAPAL Research and Scholarship, and then we'll talk about the editors. So we've got Maureen Babb from the University of Manitoba. We've got Roger Chabot from the University of Western Ontario. Myself, Michelle Goodridge from Wilfrid Laurier University. And then the editors from CJAL are Kristen Hoffman from the University of Western Ontario and Eveline Hoffman from the University of Toronto. Next slide. So what to expect? We're hoping that we will give you both the author and editor perspective throughout the process of selecting journals all the way through to revisions and publication. So the first half, we will focus on choosing the right journal, submitting to a journal. We will pause for some questions. The second half, we'll talk more about revisions and acceptance and what to do if it is rejected, which is always sad, but there are things that we can do. And then we'll have more time for questions. So we're hoping this is a back and forth kind of dialogue as well. That being said, feel free to post your questions anytime in the chat. We'll have someone monitoring it, but please keep yourself muted just so that we're clear and able to be heard. And we're hoping that it'll be an hour of presentation with a good solid half hour at the end for questions. Okay, so step one, choosing a journal. So choosing a journal can be a bit daunting. It can be hard to find out where to start. Where do I even find out what journals are out there? What matches what it is that I'm interested in publishing? So we've got some ideas here. So one is to check out the University of Saskatchewan's list of peer-reviewed LIS journals, which is great if you are publishing straight in the LIS stream. It gives a full comprehensive list. It also has some open access material in there so that you can kind of pick and choose who you think would be worth researching and approaching. Other ideas include using Ulrich's Global Serials Directory, if your institution currently subscribes to it. And it also includes journals that are in LIS, but also outside of LIS, which could be important to you depending on what it is you're publishing and with whom. And then also getting acquainted with the directory of open access journals. And again, both LIS and non-LIS options, but thinking about whether or not you want to go open access and what is out there, what is available, and who you can approach. Next slide. So writing a query letter. So this idea is coming from a recent article published by ACRL called Finding It a Fit Faster. So tips for writing a good query letter to LIS journals specifically. But the tips that are included in there include, it helps you choose the right journal to publish in. You kind of get to gauge the enthusiasm of the editors for your idea. Sometimes that right away can tell you if it's a good fit or not, or if they've got suggestions. And then these suggestions can help before you even begin the writing process. So if this is the journal you really want to go with, you think you have a really good idea, they get back to you, maybe they can even kind of point you in the right direction to really start that writing process. You can also get clarity on submission guidelines prior to submitting it, because the last thing you want to do is submit it and not follow these guidelines, which we will talk about. And if it's not a good fit, sometimes the editors are super helpful and they will provide you other ideas of who you could submit to, something that might fit better your idea. Now, I say all this with a caveat that it's not always appropriate to send a query letter, but it can be a way for you to establish some sort of a connection and get a better idea if your idea is a good fit for their journal. So kind of feel it out, see what you get, ask maybe some friends and colleagues if they've published with them before. But generally, sending these sorts of letters out is mostly not harmful, and sometimes you'll get a quick response, and that can be very helpful. Next slide. And then these are just a whole bunch of random tips that I've come up with from my experience. So pick journals and special editions that really fit. Don't try to shoehorn your idea into something else. But there's lots of stuff out there and lots of places where you can get published. So it's best to really do your homework and figure out what matches closest to what it is you're trying to get out there. Another idea is to join listservs and monitor social media for calls for submissions. These could be for special issues that are outside of the journal's regular publications. And these special issues may speak more to what it is that you're doing. Look up articles that the journal has published in the past as a comparison. What do these look like? What are people talking about? Does this fit the kind of vein where I want to contribute? What sort of formatting, what sort of bits and pieces are they including in there? Is this the kind of style that I do too? You can also look at bibliometric and all metric data if this is important to you. So for some folks who go through the tenure process, it can sometimes matter where you publish and what their rankings are. So that can contribute to where you choose to go with your publication. And also think outside of LIS journals. So your topic may be multidisciplinary. Maybe you're working with a faculty member. Maybe you're doing stuff with educational developers. And while LIS journals obviously are our first thought, they may not be the best fit for our particular topic. So think about that. And find a journal that matches the stage that you're at. And I say this because, you may have already written the thing. So you want to be able to submit the completed article. Some are into that, some are not. Some will take an abstract, so you can more pitch an idea or a line of research that you would like to do. And then that's how you kind of get in. So find one that matches where you are at this point. And make sure you're carefully reading about the journal's copyright and licensing policies, and if there's any fees related to publishing with them. There's a whole slew of information out there. We can talk about it further, but different journals afford authors different rights to their content and licensing, and whether you can post it in a digital repository, for example. So this is something you're going to want to research and have an understanding of before you put that publication out there. Obviously explore open access. I'm a big open access supporter, so keep an eye out for that. And don't be afraid to reach out to editors if you have questions. From my experience, most of them are incredibly nice and friendly, and they will try their best to answer your questions and point you in the right direction. Next slide.
Hi, everyone. I'm Eveline Houtman. I'm here as one of the editors of the Canadian Journal of Academic Librarianship, or CJAL for short. And when you're trying to figure out if a journal is a fit for you, one of the things you're going to want to do is spend some time on the journal website. So we're using CJAL as an example of what the kinds of things you can find on a journal website. And each journal website is going to be a little bit different, so you're going to have to orient yourself when you go in. Sometimes they really bury things, it feels like things for guidelines for authors can be really buried sometimes. We'll get to ours in a few minutes. This is what you would find if you click on the About page. You get things like focus and scope, the peer review process, publication frequency, open access policy, and so on. This is from CJAL, so we've hidden a lot of things under the About page. The next slide, please. I'm not going to go into detail about everything because I don't have time, but just I wanted to highlight a few things, the kind of things that you can see on a journal website that can help you figuring out if it's the right fit. So this is the first paragraph of our focus and scope section. And it says right away, we're bilingual, we're an open access journal. Like Michelle, I'm a big promoter of open access. It's important to me to publish in open access. If it's important to you, we're telling you right up front, we're open access. And if you check out our open access policy listing, you'll see there's no fees involved. You don't have to have a geographical focus, even though Canadian is part of our name. But if you do have a geographical focus, it should be Canada. This is not the space where you want to write about academic libraries in Japan, say. Next slide, please. This is something else I wanted to highlight. The journal is open to all research methodologies, and this is not true of all LIS journals by any means. We welcome theoretical work that may not be suitable for traditional empirical focused LIS journals. So the very first article I worked on was on autoethnography. And autoethnography is still relatively new to the discipline, and it's not accepted everywhere. So right away, we've done some fiction. Right now, there's an interview going through the editing process. Right now, there's in peer review, there's a short article that has a digital humanities project attached to it. So we're open to different kinds of methodologies. And again, that's maybe sets us apart from some of the other LIS journals. And so our emphasis, as this says, is on publishing strong articles that add something new to the literature. And the next slide again. But you must present a substantive analysis of a topic. Sometimes when you're new to writing and you don't know what to write about, you're writing about something that you're doing in your library. That could be the basis of an article, but you have to go beyond a description of what you're doing to make sure you include what is the so what? What makes this program or whatever it is you're describing significant? Do some analysis. Make sure you establish why it's relevant and important, and so on. You need compelling arguments that are grounded in scholarly discourse, contextualize what it is that you're writing about in the discipline, in LIS or broader, not just a simple description of something. And the next slide. We have high standards, but this is again something that might set CJAL apart. We do explicitly, as you can see here, aim to support and encourage authors whose work does not initially meet those standards. So in fact, we have a process where at a certain point, we may suggest to an author, we can set up a mentorship arrangement for you with the editorial board members. And that's sort of outside the peer review process. And it's totally private between the mentor and the authors. And then at a certain point, the article can come back to us or maybe not, depending on what goes on there. But it's extra support that we offer as CJAL. One thing I didn't make a screenshot of in terms of fit is length of your article. If you're writing a 20,000 word article, well, you're going to have trouble finding a home for that period. But if the journal says its upper limit is 6,000 words, don't submit a 10,000 word article. Just pay attention. I guess my overarching message is pay attention to what the journal is saying about itself. The material is there for a reason, for you to read it and pay attention and not submit things that don't fit. So I think that's back to you, Michelle.
Actually, it's off to me.
Oh, I'm sorry, Roger.
That's okay, no worries. So hi, everybody. My name is Roger Shabat. I'm at Western, and I'll be talking to you today about how to submit to a journal and what to expect while undergoing this process. Next slide, please. So the strongest advice I have here is sort of following on what my colleagues have said. Is to begin to check for and to actually follow all the submission requirements. And you'll be able to find this sort of information under headings like information for authors or submission requirements. And you'll find a variety of information that's listed here. So each journal has its own idiosyncrasies in regards to how it likes manuscripts submitted to them for publication. So even though you may have a sense of how one journal likes to do it, you may find out that another journal doesn't like it in the exact same way. So you really have to research and get an idea of what they're looking for here. And some of these requirements may be ones that we sort of already mentioned. So length, type of article, whether if it's is it a review article, is it a report of empirical research, a theoretical paper. So like others have said, some of these may or may not be acceptable. You also may have requirements here like use of images or figures. So some journals want you to include them separately rather than in the body of the manuscript. And that's where you'll find this sort of information as well. Watch for any templates that they want you to use. So they may have prepared something for you to sort of cut and paste your manuscript into. And they may have preferences whether they want it submitted by PDF or by Word. And watch out for the citation style or the larger publication style that they're wanting to use. So often they'll use a common citation style such as APA or Chicago, but you'll also find house citation styles, or the one example I can think of is the journal Information Research, which is primarily an information behavior journal based out of the UK. And so their house style is essentially APA. It's mostly APA, but everything is Britishized. So they prefer, all the S's and instead of Z's and things like that, and use single inverted commas instead of double inverted commas. So that's the sort of thing that you may see variations on. And that's where this sort of is annoying at the same time to have to deal with that, but watch out for those sorts of things. And also up front, you may find other requirements that are being asked of you, such as an abstract for your manuscript, keywords, basically for search engines, those sort of pinpoint the main ideas that your article fits into in the larger discourse. They may ask you to identify potential reviewers for the paper, and they may ask you to submit a cover letter on top of your manuscript. And basically that just introduces you, your paper and its contributions, how you think it would be a good fit for the paper. And then this is also here in the cover letter where you might identify potential reviewers. And also in the cover letter, they may ask you to compare it to other articles in the journal. So it's like, my article is similar to others, and just it's trying to provide some extra arguments to the fit to that your article is going to fit into their journal. And so the cover, that's fine. That's fine, don't worry about it. So the potential reviewers, the cover letter is a bit less ubiquitous of a requirement, but it still is out there. So it really will depend on the size or quality of their editorial board, whether they need you to, or the uniqueness of your topic, and whether they need you to suggest potential reviewers to them. Next slide, please. Okay. So one important thing to note, if you don't already know this, is that you can only submit a completed paper to one journal at a time. So you can't shop your paper around. You can't write one and then send it out to 10 different people and see who picks it up first. Generally, that's not accepted, and other papers could choose to reject your paper for that reason if they find out that you've been shopping it around like this. So avoid that problem by just submitting it to one journal at a time. So do your research ahead of time to find, really you're trying to find the best fit, so that you only really have one option, the best option for your paper. In submitting, journal editors may be using a variety of applications, such as open journal systems or some other proprietary systems to manage your submission and the peer review process and the publication process. So there could be a lot of variety in what happens after you hit submit. So, or editors may not be using anything at all. So there's a lot of variety of what happens after. So just be prepared that this experience, as you go through your publishing career, will not, there won't be any uniformity here. Next slide, please. So an important part of the submission process is anonymizing your paper. So most peer-reviewed journals will have a double-blind peer review process where both the reviewers and the authors do not know who each other are, so that's why it's double blind. So you want to anonymize any references to yourself in the paper before submission. So you can do this with your in-text and bibliographic references. So I provided some examples here in APA or Chicago. Basically follow this, make it look like it's the citation style that you're using. Alternatively, you can refer to yourself in the third person rather than the first. So instead of using I, I did this research, and then you put like author and the year. You can say like, oh, Shabbat 2019 did this, but it's not necessarily evident that it's you who, it's not necessarily evident that it's self-referential. Additionally, you should anonymize any references to any roles, collaborators, institutions, units, schools, etc. that could identify you. So if you have a frequent collaborator, if you say like author and your best friend, some people could maybe figure out who you are. So you want to anonymize that sort of thing as well. And you want to anonymize the hidden metadata on your paper. And so most people can forget that this exists. So this is essentially, especially in Word, this is you only really have to do it in Word. But I provided some examples here. So you're going to go to File, Properties, and then in the Summary tab, you should see your name because it's done through the registration of your edition of Word, and then just hit delete and OK, and that'll remove the metadata. And if you're not using Word, if you're using Pages or Google, you don't have to worry about it. Essentially, if you convert your document to Word or PDF, the author metadata won't export over, and so you're safe there. Next slide, please. So you've hit submit on your article, and now you're waiting for the editor to look at it. So what do you do now? How long do I have to wait? So you may get an auto reply from the management system, and then you'll hear back between 4 weeks and a year. So between 4 to 6 weeks is very speedy. 3 to 6 months is average, and on the high end, you could be waiting up to a year to hear back on whether it's gone through review or to see what the next steps are on your paper. And so this timeline will really depend on how often the journal publishes, the editor schedules and how busy the editor is, and reviewers' responsiveness. So, a review could sit in a reviewer's inbox for 3 months before the deadline and do it right just before the deadline. So it really depends on, a variety of factors and who's doing what when. Just a note here, it's totally acceptable after a reasonable silence from an editor to prompt them for an update. So don't feel that you're being rude if you politely ask for an update, because they'll understand perhaps if the reviewers are taking too long, and they'll just give you an idea of how much more things are taking, how much longer things will take. And if you really do feel like you've been ghosted by the journal, things are becoming unreasonable, and if you haven't made any commitments to a journal, it's totally okay to withdraw your paper from submission from that journal, and you can do so respectfully in writing, just informing them of your withdrawal, and then you can send it around to another, well, not send it around, but send it to another journal who would be also an alternative fit for your paper. So it's okay to, once you're submitted, you're not totally trapped by that journal. You have still some autonomy here on where it gets published. And I think that's the end of my slides.
So, sorry, Eveline here again, and we're just going back to CJAL again as an example. So again, under the About menu, you can see we have submissions, tips for authors, contact, and so on. So next slide, that's where you find it in CJAL. Again, I'm not going to go over it, but you can see it. We have a submission preparation checklist, things to think about. Author guidelines are fairly extensive. Anonymity is the top one there. It's in alphabetical order. It's also conflict of interest, layout, abstract, length, citations, spelling, images. So as authors, Roger said, there's lots of guidelines to think about in preparation. And next slide, please. Under tips for authors, we've got sort of some more informal advice about the writing and the submission and revision process. And I wanted to point out that we also put our recommended timeline for here. So it's maybe a little bit hidden, but we actually explicitly put our recommended timeline in here. I didn't put the whole thing in, but we have an estimated timeline for each stage. Now things slip for various reasons. Right now we're dealing with vacations, both on the author end and the editor end. One thing I didn't mention about CJAL already in terms of timeline is that we have a, once your article is ready, it's gone through the process of peer review, editing, copy editing, and layout, it's published immediately. Where we publish on a rolling basis, unless it's something like a special issue where we try and publish things together. So there's no delay. Once you've gone through the entire process with your article, it's published. And I did want to point that out because other journals, you may be waiting 6 months until the next issue, or sometimes a year until there's room for your article. We do publish on a rolling basis, and our detailed timeline is in there. I can't remember if I have another slide. Next slide. No, I don't. Yes, questions so far. We were going to keep moving, but there's a questions about query letter in the chat, and to some extent it's already been answered. The article that Michelle flagged on an early slide is all about query letters, and it has some good advice. And one of the questions here is whether you need an abstract. And I think that's something, query letters is another thing that you might want to check with the journal website about. Because of this session, that we noticed that we don't explicitly say anything about query letters on the CJAL website. So the editors are going to include that in our next meeting. Like, what wording do we want to put? I have mixed feelings about asking for an abstract as an editor, because abstracts are often very badly written, and it's something that needs a lot of editing. So we will be discussing what we want from a query letter, and then putting that on the website in the near future. But check out other journal websites. Some of them say, for this section, please, query the editors and put in this information. Information I would like to see is what's the topic, the description, but the so what, and what's your approach going to be, whether that's in abstract form or a little bit less formal. That's my take on the query letter. I don't know if that helps with the questions here. We probably want to move on, and then there's going to be room for more questions at the end, unless there's another question right now that somebody wants to address right away. So stay tuned for the CJAL wording on query letters, but we are open to query letters. And I think we can proceed. The next slide.
Okay, so I'm Maureen Babb from the University of Manitoba. And just a reminder, you can feel free to keep putting questions in the chat, and we will have another question period at the end. So if there was anything burning that wasn't already addressed in the chat, put in there. I'm going to be talking about revisions and acceptance from the author point of view here now. And so revisions are often, I would say, when people are new to the whole academic research, academic publishing thing, it's often a part that they're most shocked by, or most upset by, or most unprepared for, maybe. So I want to begin by clarifying that it is normal to be asked to make revisions to your manuscript prior to acceptance. They could be major or they could be minor revisions. Often major revisions, they come back as revise and resubmit. So you have to resubmit and usually go through another round of peer review in that case. Now, when you're asked for revisions, regardless of whether they're small or large, this can evoke strong emotions. You can feel upset. You can feel, this person doesn't know what they're talking about. And that's often the initial reaction, no matter how reasonable the revisions actually are. So I suggest reading your proposed revisions. Then you freak out, rage, yell at the computer monitor, complain to your friends, punch a pillow, whatever you need to do. Just get it out of your system, wait a day or two, and then come back after you've taken some time to cool down and read those revisions again. And often you'll find that they're not quite as horrible and time consuming as you initially thought they were. And at that point, that's when you can and should begin revising. Now, every now and then you'll be asked for a really quick turnaround time for revisions. And in that case, you might not get the cool down period, but try and do it in your head anyways. So that is something that you should prepare for, but do expect revisions. And the point of revisions is to make your paper better. It's not an attack on you. It's not an attack on your paper. It's just a way of saying, you know, like this is good, but it could be better. It would be stronger if you were doing this, or if you were doing this, or if you were doing that. And that's good advice to have. It will improve what you put out there into the scholarly literature. In terms of the actual act of revising, you want to make sure that you read through those suggested revisions very carefully. I recommend reading through them many times, and this is key. You have to address every point of the revision. It doesn't mean that you have to accept what everybody or what your peer reviewers have said. It doesn't mean that you have to take every single piece of advice, but you do have to address it. And if you don't accept, if you don't agree with their revisions and you decide to say, no, I'm not doing that, you have to justify why you aren't. And it has to be a good justification. It can't just be like, I'm not doing that because I'm lazy or because I don't want to. It has to be, I don't feel that this is a worthwhile revision, and here is why, because it doesn't support the argument, because it's out of scope, whatever the case may be. And another important thing is you have to show your work. So you don't just make the edits and send it back again. You have to keep track of every single change you've made. Some changes require commentary or explanation beyond just the simple fact that I've made this change. You'll want to talk about why you've made those changes, or especially if it's slightly different than what the reviewer asked for. And depending on the journal, and this varies from journal to journal, but you may be asked to use track changes to keep track of your revisions. Some of them really don't want you to do that. Some of them really do want you to do that. And there's a tool called a revision table that I'm going to talk about, but this is a very helpful way for both you and for as the author and you as editors to show the revisions and how it went through. So a revision table looks sort of like this. This is the version that I use for myself. And it can vary. Often if I'm working with a co-author, I'll have a category for like who's taking care of, like a column for who's taking care of this. Is it me or is it my co-author, and is it done? And so, but you can see here, I've got the initial reviewer comment, right? So often these are sort of long-winded, right? So you include percentages in your results, but do not include end values. End values should be added alongside percentage values to make it clearer what you are discussing. And then it's best to do a simplified version. The simplified version is add end values to the data. And so then I note, was that change made? Yes, I made that change. And then the description of the changes, the end values have been added in brackets beside percentage values throughout the paper. And then I've got a notes field here, notes or comments field. And this is a field that I use to sort of communicate with myself. So it's a column that I will remove before I send it to the editors. And you do send the revision table alongside your edited manuscript. So it's not just for you, but if you have a column for yourself, you may want to delete that. Likewise, if you're communicating with your co-authors saying who's handling this, the editors don't need to see that. That's irrelevant information to them. So you can get rid of those columns and just send off the one that says reviewer comment, simplified version, change made, and description of the changes. That's what the editors need. Now you may have something where you say no. So the bottom one I've got there, you have not addressed how this relates to the use of virtual reality in library spaces. Expand on this. And so the simplified version is talk about virtual reality. And I've said no, because this is well outside the scope of the paper, which is on collection management in academic libraries. And then my note to myself is like, what? Why is this even here? Why is this a comment that anybody's considering at all? And some of them may be, like the examples I've shown have been relatively simple, but you may have ones where you have very long changes or very long descriptions, but I had to fit them onto a slide for you guys to look at. So if I've picked simple ones, add end values, cite work by slam dunk, etc. And But this is the basic structure of a revision table, and it is probably the best tool that you can have when doing revisions. Now, sometimes you get revisions that are contradictory. You'll have reviewer 1 is saying like, oh, you got to do this. And reviewer 2 is saying, oh, no, you got to do that. One of the things that I often get is I get, oh, your writing's very clear from one reviewer, and oh, your writing's very simplistic from another reviewer. I like it from reviewer 1. I hate it from reviewer 2. And so you need to sit down and say like, okay, do I need editorial guidance on this? You can reach out to the editors and say like, look, the things that people are saying here, I can't do both of them. I have to only do one. So if you're not sure, you can reach out to the editors and say like, do you have feedback on this? Is there one that you think is more accurate that I should be doing? Or you can use your own judgment. For instance, when I get complaints on my writing from one editor and praise on my writing for another editor, I don't tend to change my writing style. But when you do this, justify again why you did or didn't make the changes, and do flag to the editor that the revisions were contradictory so that they know that you're not just ignoring something. Now, finally, what about bad feedback? You do occasionally get bad feedback or bad feedback. And these tend to fall into a few categories. Now, the first category is what I call bad feedback in quotes. So the reviewer has misunderstood what you're saying, and therefore they've presented a change that you should make that doesn't actually make sense to whatever your paper is trying to convey. Now, this is a bad piece of feedback because it is telling you to do something that doesn't make sense, but it's important feedback because it's telling you that what you were trying to say isn't clear. And so instead of making the revision that they've asked for, you need to look at your work and say, what here isn't clear? How did they read this and come to that conclusion, which is not what I'm trying to say at all? So you need to take time to clear up your writing, to fix where the misunderstanding is. And then when you're responding to the revision, you say, I didn't make this change, but I made this change because they were interpreting it as this when I was trying to say that. And so I've cleared this up and hopefully it makes more sense. Now, there are just straight bad reviews where it's not something that is in your writing that's making it unclear, but it's something that's bad because it is bad. For instance, the reviewer does not appear to have accurate knowledge of a topic. So for instance, their knowledge is outdated or they have an incorrect understanding of a concept. And if this is the case, then you want to go through and say, no, I'm not making these changes because this reviewer's understanding of this is inaccurate, and here is why. And you may need to cite additional sources here or discuss concepts in detail. This is one of those things on your revision table that may be really, really long. Another, and I would say this one's more common, another thing that happens is that you will get reviews from people who wanted you to write a completely different paper than you did. So their suggestions can be, well, this is fine, but I would have preferred to see blah, 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 blah. And it's like, okay, that's great, but that's not what this paper is about. And so when you respond to that, you can usually respond by saying like, this is interesting, but it's not what my paper is about. And I'm not going to change the entire topic of my paper to fit what the reviewer wants. And then this one, this final one is, I would say, uncommon. It's never happened to me, but it's certainly happened to people who I know, where the reviewer is incredibly rude or uncollegial, maybe where they're insulting you personally, where they're calling your work stupid, where they're just being incredibly cruel and unkind. And this, I have heard horror stories from people who this was their first attempt at publication and they got these really rude comments. Now, when we were discussing this, in creating these slides, the editors from CJAL were like, the editor should have caught that and not sent those comments on. But sometimes they do for whatever reason. And if they do, here's what you need to do. You need to ignore that because that person is a jerk. And then you need to flag the inappropriate language and the inappropriateness of the review to the editors. And I mean, hopefully the editors will respond in a decent way. If they don't, and they say, no, that's fine, I personally would suggest withdrawing your paper and submitting it to a different journal. But be aware that that does happen occasionally. If it does happen, this is not your problem, and it should not make you feel bad. It is their problem, and you should be able to move on from that. So now I will pass it off to one of the editors.
Thank you. So as Maureen said, revisions are extremely common. And just to give you a sense of how common they are, I went through the first 6 years of CJAL, so from 2015 to the end of 2020. And of the papers that we sent for review, there were 50 some papers that went out for review. None of them were accepted with no revisions. 38% we requested minor revisions, and 61%, so almost 2/3 of the papers that went out for review went back to the authors with the major revisions or that revise and resubmit decision. And eventually 65% of all of the papers that we sent for review were published, including several of those revise and resubmit. So it's not an end to the publication process at all. It's just part of the process and it happens. So again, being asked for revisions does not mean that we don't want to publish your paper. It means that the editors and the reviewers are seeing ways to strengthen your paper. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk more about this revise and resubmit category of decision because, as Maureen said, requests for revisions evoke strong emotions, and especially these major revision requests. So again, we want you to remember that this is not a rejection. It is, however, a signal that we are asking for major changes. That is, changes that are substantial enough that we think it's likely that the paper is going to need to go back out for review so that a reviewer can have a second look at the paper and give feedback. I will say, though, that even though we sometimes ask for those major changes and signal that we're going to send it back out for peer review, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes the revisions are strong enough to be accepted with just editorial review. Sometimes we don't send it back out for peer review because the revisions weren't substantial enough to address what we felt was needed, and the authors didn't want to make those more substantial revisions and ended up withdrawing their paper. To talk a little bit just about minor revisions, this may go out to you as an accept conditional on revisions decision. And this typically means that the changes aren't quite so substantial. The paper is generally going to look the same as the first version of the paper with a few small edits. And so the editor feels that they can review those changes and make a decision without additional input from reviewers. Again, being asked for revisions is very common, and you are not alone in revising papers. Next slide, please. And also to pick up on something that Maureen talked about, if things aren't clear to you in terms of what revisions we're asking for, we at CJAL are very open to giving guidance to authors on how to address the reviewer comments. And we have done this for authors by email. We've also had phone calls and Zoom meetings just to be clear and clarify things for authors. I also want to touch back on the revision table that Maureen talked about. This is very important for us as editors to see because it helps us assess your revised version. We don't ask for a revised manuscript with track changes, and so we rely on your revision response to tell us where to look in your revision for the changes and improvements that you've made. I'll also say the table that Maureen presented is great, but if you're not a table person, we don't need your response in a table format. It could just be a text document or an email with, what the reviewer said, and then a paragraph with your explanation of what you changed or didn't and why. But we do need all the information that Maureen presented in the table. So that slide is a good one to refer back to. And if you don't send a kind of revision response with your revision, we're going to come back and ask for it from you. And I just want to emphasize again, You don't have to make every change that the reviewers or the editors ask for, but you do need to explain and justify not making a change. And I want to say again, we want to see authors succeed. We want to publish papers, or we wouldn't exist as a journal. And so we want to help you work through that reviewer feedback. So next slide. One of the ways that we do this is to provide mentoring to authors. Mentoring is provided by the members of our editorial board. We started offering mentoring a few years ago, and we've only had a handful of authors go through this process so far. Some of those authors, their papers have been published and others haven't. But generally, I think the people who have gone through it have found it to be a positive and supportive experience. So in most cases, we will suggest mentoring, and it's an editor who typically has suggested this, when the scope of revisions that we're asking for seems really quite significant, and we suspect that the author might benefit from some extra guidance. And so if you're working with CJAL through a paper, and we suggest that you consider being mentored by someone on our editorial board, please consider it an opportunity to interact with an experienced author who can guide you in improving your manuscript, and know that we are suggesting this because we want to see you succeed and we want to publish your paper. So mentoring, just to clarify to you the difference between asking an editor for clarification and the mentoring. The clarification would be pretty brief. The mentoring is much more in-depth and involved, and the mentor working with the author through specific parts of their paper. And next slide. The last thing that I want to mention is to please stay in touch and don't ghost us. If you intend to revise your paper, let us know. If you don't intend to revise your paper, let us know. And if you don't intend to revise your paper the way we've requested, that's fine. 23% of our submissions overall have actually been withdrawn by authors. And so that's also a fairly common occurrence. As Eveline said earlier, we publish papers when they're ready. And so our timelines are generally flexible. We're not waiting for a particular deadline associated with an issue. So we can work together with authors to come up with a timeline that works for both of us. We do want to keep momentum, and so we do try to keep some deadlines in place so that we can keep things moving. The one exception to this is our special or thematic issues, when we do want to publish the articles all at the same time, and so there are more pressing deadlines there. And next slide. The last section here that we're going to talk about is what happens when your paper is not accepted. And in the first three sections that we've talked about, we've given the author's perspective first and then the editor's, and this last one, we're going to flip it. So I'm going to talk first, and then Roger will tell you how you deal with it as an author when your paper is not accepted. I do want to say that the acceptance rate for CJAL is quite high. So 65% of the papers that we have sent for review have been published. That's 55% of all papers submitted. So we do want to see authors succeed, and we work hard to make that happen, but some papers are rejected. So next slide. The most important things that I want you to keep in mind are that rejections happen to all authors. You are not alone when your paper is rejected. All of us on this panel have had papers rejected. And also, the rejection decision is not a rejection of you as an author, but a rejection of this paper or this journal. Again, it is not a rejection of you. Next slide. First, before I talk about desk rejections, I just do want to say that we are also open to giving feedback when your paper is rejected. If we can help you get your paper published somewhere else, we can do that. We're happy to do that. We may give a little less feedback than if we were talking with you about revisions, but we are still happy to have that conversation with you about what you can improve. Okay, so on to desk rejections. There's basically two types of rejections that you can get as an author. And the first one is called a desk rejection because the paper is rejected at the editor's desk or when it first is submitted. And this is essentially a decision to not send the paper for peer review. Usually happens because the paper doesn't fit with the journal's focus and scope. And these are three common reasons that papers have been desk rejected from CJAL. Either the paper is just not related to academic librarianship, or it has a geographical focus and the focus is not Canada, or the paper doesn't show substantive analysis of the topic. And in that case, we have suggested, in fact, that authors make some revisions to strengthen that part of the paper before we send it out for review. And sometimes authors have been willing to do this and the paper has gone on to be reviewed and accepted and published. Other times the authors aren't willing to do that and they go somewhere else. Desk rejects can also be papers that don't conform to the journal's requirements, such as length or style or not being anonymized. So it is important to pay attention to those things. About 11% of CJAL submissions in our first 6 years were desk rejects and weren't sent off for review. Next slide. The second type of rejection is perhaps what most people think of when you think of a paper being rejected, and that's the post-review rejection. Only 10% of our papers have received a rejection after going through peer review. And that is usually either because the editors and the reviewers think that revisions won't be able to do enough to the paper to get it to a publishable state. Even with revisions, the paper is not going to meet our standards for publication. Or because when an author sent back revisions, we concluded that those revisions were not enough to address the reviewer feedback and get the paper to a publishable state. But again, more often authors have withdrawn their submissions after receiving reviewer feedback, perhaps deciding that they didn't want to make those revisions or that it wasn't a good time for them to make those revisions, which is a little sad. We'd like to see more people want to work with us the way that we want to work with authors to get papers to a publishable state, but that does happen. And now I'm going to hand it back to Roger to give the author's perspective when your paper is not accepted.
Great, thanks, Kristen. So from the author perspective, so the first piece of advice is it's okay to be disappointed. This is sort of a crappy feeling that you may be feeling, and that's okay. And then the next pieces of advice are essentially to continue to work on your paper. So if we continue to rework your paper, if the quality of the paper remains an issue, get help from an experienced colleague or a mentor, somebody that that can help you. If it is the issue, then that's a bit more easy to deal with, and you can consider another venue for your work. But the unfortunate thing here is that you'll have to start again from the beginning of the submission process again at a new journal. So in my experience, a lot of LAS journals have a fairly broad mission, so you're likely to find another home for it in LAS at least. And the last piece of advice is to identify other ways in which your work can be productive for you. So it's not just wasted months. So perhaps you can work your paper into a conference presentation that you can present on. The conference is also a good opportunity to get additional feedback on your work from colleagues and people who may not know your work generally. So usually there's an abstract or an extended abstract or another paper to provide an opportunity to get feedback on that work. And the last way is to perhaps consider a revamping. So this is a lot more work potentially, but maybe your piece is better suited for a non-academic audience. So there's venues like The Conversation, which are sort of geared towards providing this bridge between the academy and the public. So that's another, or perhaps you want to start a blog and you can use your work to sort of start sort of non-peer reviewed writing. And yeah, that's it from the author point of view. So we'll come to the end of our presentation for today. So we have booked a half an hour, but we're happy now to take questions from any point on any topic that we discussed in the past hour, or have a conversation if you want to talk about anything else. related to publishing. And so I'll monitor the chat for any questions that come in. Yeah, so if you could please write your question in the chat, that'd be ideal.
And I think too, we're a small enough group here in attendance that if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question that way instead of in the chat, that should be okay too. And I'll just, while we're waiting for questions to come up, I'll just remind everyone that we are recording this, and we'll share the recording to YouTube and send the link out to everyone who registered for the session, and perhaps through some other CAPAL channels. We'll also be sharing a PDF of the slides, and so you'll have all of our notes from the presentation as well.
And just to build on that, we originally had talked about reading the questions out so they would go on the recording, but then we had a whole Q&A session in chat. And I didn't read the whole thing out, so I'm not sure if those...
I was just going to suggest the same thing.
Yeah.
So maybe while we wait for new questions, we'll read out some of the old ones in there.
Right. Shall I read the question and somebody else read the responses?
The person who answered can read the responses.
All right. So I'm going to read it out on behalf of Annetta. Is it best to send a query letter if your article is still in the works and you don't have a finalized abstract? And I did say we'll get to the question in a bit, and then Michelle did answer.
Yes, so this is my perspective, mind you, as an author, but I would think you would want to be pretty close to a finished abstract just to make sure you're giving a very clear idea of what you plan to do in the article, as opposed to just giving out your general topic or your research question that you plan to answer, including your methodologies, the so what factor, all that stuff is really important. And if you can write it in an abstract type format to summarize the whole thing, that kind of makes sense. But I would think you'd want some meat to it before you're sending it out.
And then Annetta had a follow-up question. Is it recommended to share your abstract with multiple journals, or is this the same as shopping around?
And I said that sending multiple query letters at a time is just fine, and that can help you determine the best journal to submit to. So feel free to send your abstract as many places as you like, but when you're ready to submit your complete paper, that can only be with one journal at a time.
And then Marta had a question, which I think was already answered in the slides themselves, but was where would you justify what you're doing in the revisions in the comments? And I think that was answered in the presentation itself already. And Marta, you said yes, it was
the revision table or the revision document.
Yeah. And I think we have a new question. So Roger, do you want to take back over on the question?
Sure. So Joshua asked, Roger mentioned the possibility of providing a list of peer reviewers. Are there some good recommendations for developing such a list? Should you, for example, should you focus on people you don't know, seek their publications for similarities in subject matter, their expertise, geography? So how I would answer this is like, those are great strategies to start with. This is often can be sort of a difficult question, or it's sort of, I find it always a struggle to come up with reviewers too. So it's definitely not like an easy thing to like always come up with. What I've done in the past is relied upon the people that I've cited in my paper as generally, people who are doing work sort of in my orbit. And so perhaps people that you're working with in your sort of like same subject area that should be like, oh, I know my colleague, at University of British Columbia, she does this sort of thing too. She might be a good peer reviewer, but you don't know. So you probably want to provide 2 or 3 because you won't know if they actually approach them.
Yep.
And the editor may also have, they'll often have an editorial board that's sort of pre-established as well. And so there may not necessarily, just because you listen, they may not necessarily be relied upon because there may be a fit from the editorial board as well.
And just to add up to that, from the CJAL perspective, we do have a list, our own list of peer reviewers. And we built it in such a way that they identified areas where they felt competent to review. That doesn't mean we don't go outside that list sometimes. I also noticed, and I hadn't seen this before, Kristen, I noticed when I was reviewing the website that we actually have a little section that says, if you want to be a peer reviewer, send us your CV. So if you feel like you want to be a reviewer, and it's a great way of learning. It is work. It's not easy to necessarily do a peer review always, but it is work. But if you want to be a peer reviewer, send us your CV. The contact information is on the website, and we can add you to our list, and with some areas that you're interested in.
And there's a question about the mentorship program that CJAL has, and does anyone know of a publishing mentorship program that is not tied to submitting to a specific journal? And I wonder if someone from the Research and Scholarship Committee could answer that.
So the CAPAL Research and Scholarship Committee has actually just started a new mentorship program. They're still looking for mentees and especially mentors that covers academic librarian research or librarian research in like a broad sense. So that would include information, that would include helping you prep your documents for publication. So if you're interested in that, I believe if you just go to the CAPAL website, it's up there right now. So yes, we do know of another mentorship program.
And I'll also add that at least at Western libraries, we do a lot of work to help each other as librarians and archivists. And so people will ask colleagues, hey, can you help me with this? Or I know you published a paper recently. Would you be willing to read mine and give me some feedback? And so those informal networks can also be good sources of mentorship for authors.
Yeah, and it's always a decent idea to just have somebody else, some colleague, even if it's not their exact area, just have a look at it, because like, you know how it is when you've been staring at a paper for like weeks, you're just like, yeah, it's perfect, I'll send it off right now, it'll be great. And like, you've been staring at it for 10 weeks, you have no idea.
If you're lucky enough, you can find yourself a little writing group. And if you find people that you trust.
If you don't have.
If you can find that is the best thing ever. I've decided is to have a little writing group where you have trusted peers, trusted friends who are willing to say that just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Or I don't get that part.
We had a question from Marta. Do editors look at the peer
Sorry, you're a bit faint there.
Oh, sorry. For a question from Marta, do editors look at the peer reviews before they send them out to an author?
You want to go ahead, Kristen?
Yes.
Yes.
If an editor ever doesn't do that, they are not doing their job as an editor. So yes, we look at the peer review feedback. We consider it carefully. We often try to give some guidance to an author in terms of what to particularly pay attention to. Might even try to clarify how to deal with some of the contradictory reviews. Editors do take different approaches to that. So some kind of give more commentary than others, but yes, editors definitely should be looking at the peer reviews before they're sent to authors. And Amanda has a question. Are there any common or typical revisions that you find occur in many submissions? In other words, how can we plan to fix those types of things before we submit? That's a really good question. Eveline, do you have a sense?
I don't know if I'm far enough along to know if there's it feels like every article is a new thing.
So I'll jump in. I'd say one of the things that Maureen touched about, her quote unquote bad feedback, where the reviewers are asking for changes that aren't within the scope of your paper, but what it's signaling is that you haven't been clear about the scope of your paper. I do find that that's fairly common. And I think that that tends to happen because authors are just so, and I've had this happen for papers that I've submitted places too. You're so wrapped up in your topic that you forget how someone else is going to read it. And so that step of getting feedback from someone else before you submit can really help with that. But I'll also say, this is something that I've started to think about as an author myself, is to look at the peer review process as an opportunity for feedback and not as a test that I'm trying to pass. And so I will write papers and to like the good enough stage right now and say, okay, well, I'm not sure if I should add more here or not. So I'm just going to send it in like this. And if the reviewers and editor think that I need to add more, they'll tell me and I'll fix that in revision. So
if I could add something else, or two things. One is that in LIS, because the journals tend to be very broad, you can't assume that people are going to have the same background knowledge of the topic that you do, particularly if you're writing on a relatively specialized area of LIS. That's if you're coming from a background where you've been writing for very specialized fields with very specialized journals for those, you might not be used to providing the same background information that you need to in an LIS journal. The other thing that I would say from an author perspective is that while there may not be common or typical revisions that occur for everybody who's submitting, you will find as you submit more papers that you personally have areas that will be flagged almost every time. And so you need to, as an author, take the responsibility and say, okay, they complain about that every time. I need to change that. I need to like make that clear now before I submit so that it doesn't get flagged this time. And
yeah,
so,
I guess I would just add, yeah, revisions for clarity are really common. And I think a lot of it is, again, what you're saying, you just assume people's knowledge where the reader doesn't need you to fill in more. So clarity is sometimes just clarity of writing is kind of a common thing. It's not even necessarily a peer review thing. It's almost something that we as editors are addressing at a certain stage. Like just, you need to be more clear about what's going on here because I'm an outsider and I'm not quite getting what's, you're describing your program. I'm not quite just getting what's going on because you've left out some things. So yeah, sometimes just structure. You've got a whole section on X and then a section on Y, and all of a sudden X appears later again. You know, just think about how to structure your program. But that's on the bigger picture, that's sometimes one of the lesser things to worry about. It would be nice though if authors worried about it, I have to admit. Yeah, clarity is a big one.
Oh,
Go ahead,
sorry.
Michelle.
Sorry, Eveline.
It's okay.
One thing I would add is Maureen really hit the nail on the head. Like the more you write and the more you submit, you start to realize what people pick up on. And for example, mine is I like to write in a very common language. I like to really make my things accessible and not put on that crazy academic hat and have all those fancy words pop out. So that's my writing style. And for some journals, they're totally okay with that. You can get a sense of that from other things that they have published in the past and how those authors are writing versus some of the more academic, or if I'm cross like doing interdisciplinary work, then I definitely have to put the academic hat on and start, busting out my thesaurus to make sure that I've got the right language and the right prose for the situation. But that's something I've learned from myself in my writing, and you kind of get a feel for those sorts of things the further on you go.
And I'll offer a final piece. So I also teach in MLS programs. And so I see a lot of papers from, MLS students. So I would say one thing, so I'm assuming that's been part of your trajectory at some point. And so some of you may be new recent graduates anyways, is that make sure you're connecting it to that substantial analysis that we mentioned earlier, is that you're answering the so what question and you're connecting it to either to like a real life purpose or basically that you're answering that question. So your description may be really quite excellent of what's going on, but you haven't connected it to something larger.
There is a question in chat as well. Do you want to go? Just wanted to flag it. Do you want me to read it or you want to read it out?
I'll read it. So Anita asks, or Aneta, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name. What are your thoughts on submitting multiple papers to the same journal? To clarify, if you already published an article in a journal, is it okay to submit a new article to that same journal, or should the author look to diversify the journals they send their material to? I can start answering that. I've recently submitted a paper to a journal that I have published in before. I don't think it's a good idea to publish in only one journal forever and ever, but I don't think there's any harm, especially in LIS where frankly there aren't all that many peer-reviewed journals to begin with, and especially not all that many peer-reviewed open access journals. But I do think you want to diversify a little bit, so to speak. But the key thing is making sure that you're submitting to the best journal for your publication. I don't know if other people have. I know that in some fields it can be, or in some universities, like they can be more finicky about that. And I feel like I come from a university where that's not a concern on anybody's radar. But maybe somebody else can speak to that.
Yeah, I think I would suggest, I don't know, I like being political with it, in a sense, to sort of fight back against the big, big academia and their sort of reliance on journal impact factors and things like that. So I tend to have like a bit of advocacy, or not advocacy, what's the word I'm looking for? Protest in where I decide to publish, trying to fight the man. And so you can also consider that sort of thing into the venues that you want to choose for. So as long as they still meet that fit, then you can also consider things that are sort of beyond the immediate paper in determining where you want to publish. So for example, you may want to support CAPAL, and so you may want to publish in CJAL as a sort of way to support the organization. And there's other reasons why you may decide to put your paper in certain places over others. And I think that's okay.
One thing, sorry, I'm still muted.
Nope.
Okay, I muted myself because there's the lawn mowing going on outside. One thing you might want to think about too is where are you reading and who are you reading and where are they publishing? Like if you're quoting a bunch of people that are published in external, maybe you want to write for that external as well, and more than once potentially. Or you might want to spread yourself around. I don't think there's an easy answer to this. But especially if your paper is a response to something that you're seeing in the literature, maybe go and publish where that literature is being published. I'm big on open access too, so to me that always figures into the choice. And as Maureen says, there's kind of a limited number of really good open access journals, so that maybe limits your thumb where you go as well.
Yeah, and speaking of open access, it's not super common in
And you're soft again.
LIS. Oh, sorry. Speaking of open access, it's not super common in LIS to have author processing charges, but if you are publishing in interdisciplinary journals or any of the journals that are sort of hybrid open access and run by major publishers, you'll want to take a look at those. Can you afford the open access fees? I'm working on a paper right now that I was going to submit actually to like a medical journal because it's related to that. But I've decided, no, I'm going to submit it to a health libraries journal. And I'm going to do that because when I looked at the open access publishing fees, it was more than my entire travel and expenses fund for an entire year. So it was like several $1,000s, and I was like, well, I can't afford that, so no. So that's something to consider too.
The one thing that's nice is if you submit to the same journal, you know what they want. So there's that comfortability, right? Like you kind of know exactly what they're looking for. And I guess I would just get a feel for your institution and processes. Like most of the time it doesn't matter where we publish for continuing or tenure applications, but some people are fussy. So some people like to see top tier journals in your applications. So if that is important, or if that's an institutional not requirement, but it's kind of part of the culture there, then consider that too. But I like Roger's fighting the power idea. It's always fun.
I don't have anything to add to that answer. I think the rest of you covered that really, really well. Are there any other questions out there from those of you still left in the room?
While we wait for additional questions, I'll just add one more thing to that.
Closer, Maureen.
Oh, sorry. I don't know why it's being so quiet. I'll just yell directly at my microphone. No, but with Evelyn was saying that, you know, you want to be publishing where you read or where you cite from. And I think I just want to reiterate that that's very, very valuable. But if you decide to publish somewhere where you don't tend to read, at least do a little bit of reading to make sure that it's at least have a look at what the journal publishes. Don't just assume that you know what it publishes and that that's a good space for it, because it might not be. Like, do your due diligence and have a look. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions. And I see that Michelle's cat is coming to tell her that it's time to not be there.
It's almost food time. Like every time he knows he's there.
Thanks everyone for your questions and participation. And thanks to the rest of the panelists. I hope we've given you the sense through this that we're happy to answer questions. And so feel free to reach out to us, either to the Research and Scholarship Committee members or to the CJAL editors. And we're happy to answer your questions and talk with you more and help you get to a point of successful publication.